The history of the Olympics spans 3 millennia, yet one of its most iconic modern rituals, the torch relay, was invented as a propaganda tool by the Nazi regime for the 1936 Berlin Games. We tend to view the Olympic Games as this pure, untouched beacon of international unity and sportsmanship, a quadrennial pause on global conflict. But when you look at the historical record, from ancient Greek religious wars to Cold War boycotts, the Games have always been an intense political battleground. Today, we are taking a deep dive into the origins, the revival, and the turbulent legacy of the world's biggest sporting event. Joining me is Jason Brumditch, a historian of international sports and culture. Jason, it is fascinating how sanitized the origin story of the Olympics has become.
Sanitized version serves a specific purpose. The International Olympic Committee, or IOC, has spent over a century cultivating an image of complete political neutrality. But if we go back to the earliest recorded games in 776 BC, the foundation was not neutral at all. These athletic contests held in Olympia were deep religious festivals dedicated to Zeus, the king of the Greek gods. And they were tied to the military and political dominance of the various Greek city-states. Competitors were not just running races, they were demonstrating their physical readiness for war.
The ancient events themselves reflect that militaristic edge. We learn in school about the foot races and the discus, but historians point to events like the hoplitodromos and the pankraton to illustrate the true nature of the competition.
The hoplodromos is a fascinating example. It was a foot race where the athletes wore a helmet, greaves, and carried a heavy wooden shield covered in bronze. It was a direct simulation of military maneuvers, reflecting the need for infantrymen to rush into battle. And then, of course, there was the pankration. It was a combination of boxing and wrestling with almost no rules, aside from prohibitions against biting and gouging. Men fought until someone submitted or lost consciousness. And as historical texts remind us, they competed entirely naked. The Greek word for nude is gymnos, which is the root of our modern word gymnasium. The athletes covered themselves in olive oil and fought in the dirt. It was a visceral display of power, pain, and endurance. The stakes were high too. There were no silver or bronze medals in the ancient games. You either won and received a crown of wild olive leaves, along with immense social capital back home, or you lost and faced public disgrace.
And yet, amidst all this brutal competition, there was the Ekateria, the Olympic truce. The story goes that warring city-states would lay down their arms to allow athletes and spectators to travel safely to Olympia. That sounds like a genuine attempt at peace.
It was a practical necessity disguised as a divine mandate. The Greek city-states were in constant conflict with one another. If they did not institute a temporary truce, no one would have survived the journey to the sanctuary of Olympia. The truce did not end wars, it paused them so the cultural and religious machinery of the Greek world could function. The games were a unifying cultural touchpoint for a fractured society. They lasted for over 8,000 years, a staggering run by any historical standard, until the geopolitical landscape of the Mediterranean shifted.
That shift came via the Roman Empire, specifically Emperor Theodosius in 393 AD.
Precisely. By the late 4th century, the Roman Empire had adopted Christianity, and Theodosius viewed the Olympic Games as a pagan practice honoring false gods. He banned the festival to consolidate Christian cultural dominance. The sanctuary at Olympia fell into ruin, buried by earthquakes and floods, and the Olympic tradition was dormant for nearly 15 centuries.
That brings us to the late 19th century, and the figure most associated with the modern games, Baron Pierre de Coubertin. The popular narrative frames him as an idealistic visionary who wanted to bring the youth of the world together in friendly competition.
The historical reality is much more complex and much more interesting. Coubertin was a French aristocrat born in 1863, and his worldview was shaped by the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. France suffered a humiliating defeat, and Coubertin, along with many of his contemporaries, believed the loss was due to the physical and moral weakness of French youth. He traveled to England and observed the sports programs at British public schools like rugby. He concluded that organized athletics built the kind of character, discipline, and physical fortitude necessary for a strong military and a robust nation.
So the father of the modern Olympics, a movement dedicated to global peace, was motivated by a desire to militarize and toughen up French boys for future conflict.
It is a remarkable irony. Coubertin began organizing congresses on physical education, and the idea of reviving the ancient Olympic Games took hold. In 1894, he organized a congress at the Sorbonne in Paris, which led to the creation of the IOC. 2 years later, the first modern Olympics were held in Athens. But those 1896 games were small and chaotic. There were only 241 athletes from 14 nations, and they were all men. Coubertin himself opposed women's participation, viewing it as impractical and uninteresting. Women did not officially compete until the 1900 Games in Paris, and even then, their participation was restricted to sports deemed appropriate, like tennis and golf.
Coubertin was also fierce in his dedication to the concept of amateurism. He believed that sport should be a gentleman's pursuit, untainted by financial gain. This obsession with amateurism created a massive class divide in the early Olympic Games.
The amateurism rule guaranteed only the wealthy could afford to compete. Working-class athletes could not take months off of their jobs to train and travel without compensation. Jim Thorpe, one of the greatest athletes of the 20th century, was stripped of his 1912 Olympic gold medals because it was discovered he had earned a tiny amount of money playing semi-professional baseball. The IOC enforced a rigid, aristocratic view of sports that persisted for decades. It was only in the late 20th century that the Olympics opened to professional athletes, transforming the level of competition and the commercial viability of the games.
The survival of the games was not guaranteed in those early decades. Reading about the 1900 Paris Games and the 1904 St. Louis Games, they seem like disasters. They were treated as sideshows to the world's fairs.
They were catastrophic for the Olympic brand. The 1900 Paris Games dragged on for 5 months, and many athletes did not realize they had participated in the Olympics. The St. Louis Games in 1904 were worse, marred by terrible organization and racist exhibitions. The turning point came in 1912 with the Stockholm Games, which were well organized and featured athletes from all 5 inhabited continents. But just as the Olympic movement found its footing, the specter of global politics intervened. The 1916 Games were canceled due to World War I, and when the Games returned in 1920 in Antwerp, the IOC barred Germany, Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire from participating. The losers of the war were uninvited.
Shatters the illusion that the Olympics transcend geopolitics. This brings us back to the 1936 Berlin Games, an event that forces us to look at how sports can be weaponized. The IOC awarded the Games to Germany before the Nazi Party came to power, but by 1936, Adolf Hitler realized the immense propaganda value of the event.
Hitler and his propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, orchestrated a massive spectacle to promote the myth of Aryan supremacy. They built a colossal neoclassical stadium linking the Third Reich to the glory of ancient Greece. And, as you mentioned at the start of our conversation, the 1936 Games introduced the torch relay. The idea was conceived by Karl Diem, a German sports official, to physically and symbolically connect the ancient site of Olympia to Berlin. Runners carried a flame across Europe, a manufactured tradition that looked fantastic on film, as seen in Leni Riefenstahl's famous documentary, Olympia.
It is disturbing that a ritual we now associate with global harmony and the Olympic spirit was engineered by the Nazi regime to project power. The 1936 Games also gave us the legendary performance of Jesse Owens, the Black American sprinter who won 4 gold medals, challenging the racist ideology on display. Yet, as historical accounts note, Owens returned to a segregated America where he still faced profound discrimination. The Olympics provided a stage for individual triumph, but they could not erase systemic realities.
That tension between the individual athlete's achievement and the overarching political narrative defines the modern Olympic era.
Following World War II, the Cold War transformed the medal table into a proxy battleground between capitalist and communist ideologies. The Soviet Union, which had ignored the Olympics for decades, joined the fray in 1952. From that point on, every sprint, gymnastics routine, and hockey game carried the weight of national superiority.
The most visceral example of Cold War tensions boiling over has to be the 1956 Melbourne Games.
The 1956 Games were a geopolitical powder keg. Just weeks before the opening ceremony, Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest to crush the Hungarian Revolution. At the same time, the Suez Crisis erupted, involving Britain, France, Israel, and Egypt. Several nations boycotted the Games, but the most dramatic moment occurred in the water polo pool, in a match between Hungary and the Soviet Union. It became known as the blood in the water match. The physical violence under the water was intense, and a Soviet player punched Hungarian star Ervin Sador in the face, splitting his skin. Pictures of Sador bleeding in the pool made headlines around the world. The athletes were fighting the war their countries were engaged in.
Boycotts have been the most consistent tool for political leverage in Olympic history. The IOC insists the Games are a apolitical gathering of youth, yet nations use absence as a weapon. The 1980 Moscow Olympics and the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics stand out as the peak of the strategy.
In December 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. In response, U.S. President Jimmy Carter issued an ultimatum: withdraw the troops, or the United States would not attend the 1980 Summer Games in Moscow. The Soviets did not withdraw, and the U.S. led a boycott that included over 60 nations. It devastated the competitive field in Moscow. 4 years later, the Soviet Union and 14 of its allies retaliated by boycotting the 1984 Los Angeles Games, citing dubious security concerns. In both cases, the primary victims were the athletes who had trained their entire lives for a moment that vanished due to foreign policy decisions.
Which raises a fundamental question about the efficacy of these boycotts. Did the 1980 boycott force the Soviets out of Afghanistan? Historical records show they remained there for another 9 years.
The boycotts rarely achieve their stated geopolitical aims. They are symbolic gestures. However, there are instances where Olympic pressure contributed to broader international movements. The most prominent example is South Africa. The IOC banned South Africa from participating in the 1964 Tokyo Olympics due to its apartheid system of racial segregation. The country was excluded from the Olympic movement for nearly 3 decades, returning in 1992 as the apartheid regime was being dismantled. The sports boycott was a visible component of the international pressure campaign that isolated the South African government.
The Olympics magnify whatever is happening in the world. When students protested in Mexico City days before the 1968 Games, the government responded with a massacre to ensure the event proceeded without disruption. At those same Games, American sprinters Tommy Smith and John Carlos raised their fists on the podium in a Black Power salute, creating an enduring image of civil rights protest. The platform is massive, and it becomes an irresistible target for anyone seeking a global audience.
That is the paradox of the Olympic Games. The IOC requires host cities to build multi-billion-dollar infrastructure, often leading to massive debt and displacement of local populations, all under the banner of international friendship. Yet, because the stage is grand, it forces the world to confront uncomfortable realities. The inclusion of the refugee Olympic team, which debuted at the Rio 2016 Games, is a perfect example. It highlights the global crisis of forced displacement in a way that a UN report cannot. The team consists of athletes who have fled war and persecution, competing under the Olympic flag. It is a powerful, humanizing initiative.
It seems we are wrestling with 2 distinct versions of the Olympics. There's the institutional behemoth, entangled in nationalism, commercialism, and political maneuvering. And then there is the athlete's experience, the human pursuit of excellence, the breaking of physical limits, the quiet moments of sportsmanship on the track or in the pool.
Both versions are authentic and they rely on each other. The political and commercial machinery funds the spectacle, creating the global audience. The athletes provide the raw emotional power that makes the spectacle worth watching. You cannot separate the ancient Pancratius fighting in the dirt of Olympia from the geopolitical struggles of his city-state, just as you cannot separate a modern gymnast from the resources and narratives of her home country. The history of the Olympics is the history of human ambition, with all its accompanying flaws and triumphs.
The games are a mirror, reflecting our highest ideals and our deepest conflicts, wrapped in the drama of competition. If you found this exploration of the Olympic Games insightful, please share this episode with someone who loves history or sports.